So, today I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Mastoureh Fathi from the Department of Sociology and Criminology at University College Cork. Mastoureh Fathi is Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the Department of Sociology and Criminology. She has published on topics of narratives of home and migration, class, gender, intersectionality, and identity. She's currently the PI of a project titled Migrants Digital Spaces, funded by Research Ireland. She was a Marie Curie Individual Fellow at the Institute for Social Science Research in the 21st Century at UCC. Her latest co-authored book is called Migration and Home, an IMISCOE short reader, and she's currently serving as the co-editor-in-chief of Irish Journal of Sociology. Mastoureh, I want to give you a big welcome. It's really fantastic to have you here with us today, also speaking of such a dear topic to so many people here on both the narrative side and the migration side. So thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Thank you, Alice. Thanks for your invitation. And so I'm going to share my screen so that I can talk about. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
All right. I think I need to share the other one. Sorry. Let me share this one because it appears on this one. Is this better?
This is better. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Okay. So Raquel, when Raquel invited me to speak, she asked me to talk about narrative and narrative analysis and what it means and how do we do it. And I don't consider myself an expert on narrative because I use narrative in many different ways. But mostly as a method for data collection and data analysis, and to also think about my work in a kind of different way. So a narrative, as I'm going to talk about, is could be considered as a story or a set of stories. So storytelling is usually very useful for understanding other people's lives as well as our own lives. So, and that's why for this talk, I decided to talk to you a little bit about how to do narrative analysis, how to do narrative interviewing, but also to show you some extracts from my research with migrants. Here we are. But before I start, I wanted to do a test with you. So, and that test, actually, I'm not asking you to do much at all. I want you to think about these questions. So I'm going to pause a few seconds after each question. Who are you? Where are you from? How did you two meet? As you can see, these questions, every time you have been asked these probably, if not millions of times, but probably more than 10 times. Who are you? Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? Especially if you're living in a country where you're considered as a migrant, or even if you're living in your own country, you have an accent that is kind of from the north or the south or the west or east of your country. You're usually kind of, as people are usually kind of interested to know about your story or the story of love and romance and so on. So what we see here is that in our daily life, we are asked questions about the stories that we tell about ourselves, about who we are and about who we are not. So as such, narrative and storytelling is quite an important way of understanding our research process and research participants. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about what is narrative and what is narrative method. I'm going to talk about constructionism because from constructionism, I'm going to talk about my method of narrative analysis, which is constructionist approach to narrative analysis. And then I'm going to look at how migration studies and narrative analysis can kind of work together. So what is narratives? Narratives are stories that we tell. We had a time at the beginning of 1980s that we called the narrative turn in social sciences, that was focusing on social experiences and issues such as inequalities, migration, gender, health, and illness, and looking at stories that are kind of telling us about these large concepts in society. So, so as such, this kind of focus on narrative, on storytelling at the beginning of 1980s, maybe towards the end of 1970s, but mostly at the beginning of 1980s, we see that this kind of turn to storytelling has had a huge impact on the wealth of literature that has been produced in narrative research. But now, what are narratives? Narratives are not always coherent. I mean, we at school, we have been kind of taught that, oh yeah, a story is what you narrate, and it has a beginning and a middle and end. So it should be, for example, one paragraph needs to lead to another, and the second paragraph needs to kind of, at the end of it, you need to kind of have an opening to the next paragraph. So basically, even at university, we are teaching and we are being taught that this is how you write. This is how you write an article, how you write a thesis, how you write a dissertation. But there, in kind of everyday life, when we are talking to people, when we are telling other people's stories, we're not always that coherent. We may actually say the end of a story at the beginning, and we may actually say that, no, let me tell you from the beginning. And then we start narrating things, which would be, it may actually be quite different to the first time that we said it. So, so basically, because of this issue, narrative analysis and narrative scholars rarely provide any guidelines about where to look for stories, because the stories can be everywhere. The stories can also be in silences. The stories can be in broken languages. Which we can see that there is a wealth of research on doing narrative analysis with people who have epilepsy, for example, people who cannot actually pronounce, or they cannot make a sentence, a kind of a sentence that what we call grammatically correct sentence. And as you can actually listen to me, I'm speaking English as my second language, so you can actually hear that sometimes I'm making mistakes in the way I talk and so on. But still, you get the gist of the idea, because you're putting every single sentence that I say in a larger context of my talk. And of course, the slides would help as well. But that's the point, that we don't have guidelines about what actually counts as a story, but we have a sense of what a story is. And then finally is that narratives have different and contradictory layers of meanings, because, for example, when you have two friends who had a dispute, and you listen to their stories on each side, and you realize that there are layers of meanings that each one of them are telling you, and what we see is that social world is also kind of constructed in very similar ways, that we are faced with different layers of meaning making. But what is narrative method? Narrative method basically is a form of qualitative analysis that is critical about seeing research participants as a source of information. This is really important, because when narrative methods have been kind of developed since 1980s, there was this kind of idea that we kind of move away from this one-way data extraction or extractionist kind of approach to doing interviews. And that, yeah, I ask as a researcher, I ask a question and the person answers, and then I ask another question and the person answers. So what we see here is that let's have a look at a different way in terms of how social reality is constructed. There are also different approaches in narrative methods: biographical life stories, linguistic or discursive structures, and kind of and methods. Some people also kind of look at how people generate meanings and kind of how they place these smaller linguistic structures within larger and wider contexts. These approaches, all of them are kind of showing how complex it is to do narrative methods and analysis. So I'm going to talk about my particular approach to narrative analysis, basically, which comes from the tradition of constructionism. So the tradition of constructionism, basically in qualitative particularly in qualitative data analysis, is not looking at natural explanation. So we are not looking at causation. We are almost not looking even at correlation, which is very much the concern of quantitative scholars. In quantitative or statistical data analysis, what we are looking at constantly is that something causes something else, or what factors are important in this outcome. So in constructionist approach or in constructionism, we are not looking at social phenomena like this. We are looking at the diverse and complex and contradicting aspect of things, that we cannot explain one phenomenon in the same way all the time, because that's one of the approaches in statistical data analysis or quantitative data analysis, that we control for a factor so that we always keep it as constant and not changing it, so that we can assess its relevance to the whole model. In constructionism, it doesn't work like that. When we talk about, for example, how gender is important in this, let's say, in this social problem, we are looking at gender from various angles. We are not just looking at whether a person is counted as a male or female, because now we know that it is much more complex than that. So, so we are moving away from those binary explanations. The other point about constructionism is that it is distinct in the ways that it accounts for the context and the different relations of power. So when we are doing qualitative data analysis, if you're a student or if you're a scholar, you will agree with me that we all need to explain the context of our research. Because let's say that if you're talking about narratives that are produced in this day and age about migration, we cannot forget that this is quite a hostile climate towards migrants. So we cannot place far-right and anti-migration narratives out of the context of what is happening in politics around the world, that how migration is being seen almost equated as a crime if it is if somebody is undocumented, if somebody is fleeing from persecution, from war and conflict, and they don't have the documents, they are being seen as almost as a criminal. So this is the context and the different relations of power that we need to take into account. And finally, the interconnectedness of different elements in a phenomenon, meaning that how we are looking at events and outcomes as not separate to the other elements in a given scenario. For example, how in intersectionality theory and analysis, we always say that different social vectors, meaning that gender, class, race, how they are interconnected with each other. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that race is the same as class or gender is the same as race. It means that the meaning of gender is always in its ontological basis has been constructed with race, meaning that, for example, when we are talking about the positions of power, we are talking about how if you are a Black person and if you're a woman, your Blackness and your woman your gender can construct a position of subordination within the axis of power compared to a white man. So within this tradition, then I wrote a book chapter. I really recommend you to read it. If you wanted to do this method of analysis, and it's quite dated, but it is quite accessible. And it's more than 10 years ago we wrote that with two colleagues. And it is called Constructionist Approach to Narrative Analysis. And in this chapter, we actually say, the constructionist approach to narrative analysis may focus on the linguistic minutiae of the co-construction of a story between a speaker and listener. But usually, it also takes into account the broader social construction of what that story is within the interpersonal, social, and cultural relations. So what does it mean? It's not that we are not looking at the language. In constructionist approach, we are looking at the language, but also how the story between the speaker and the listener is co-constructed. Now, I cannot see you. You're online, I'm online. I can only see my slides. But I know that there is an audience there. I'm not talking to myself. Sometimes I may need some kind of affirmation that, can you hear me? Am I still there? Or I'm talking to myself, right? So in this kind of interaction that we have between the listener and the kind of the speaker, we are co-constructing a meaning. Now, this is the second time I'm actually giving this lecture within a matter of 10 days. And I can hear myself that I'm saying different things, not fundamentally different things, but the way I narrate this lecture is quite different to what I said the last time. So what we see is that when we are talking about constructionist approach to narrative analysis, we are also talking about those kind of within the story elements that are kind of co-constructed between the parties that are involved in a storytelling process. And the parties that are involved are not just the speaker. The speaker is never alone, you know. The speaker is talking to someone. The speaker is talking to an audience. So we then continued saying that the narrative constructionist approach is not really interested in internal states that can be separated off from the narratives themselves. It is interested in the states produced socially by the narratives. So what it actually means is that we are looking at, as scholars, as people who are taking constructionism as the basis for this kind of narrative analysis, that how people tell the story, but also how these stories themselves are kind of referring to underlying social relations, power relations, and the contextual elements around that social phenomenon. So in this way, these narratives become really important because they become social phenomenon themselves. So I hope that it is understandable, but I can also explain more in Q&A. This kind of constructionist narrative analysis comes from a dialogic narrative analysis. And dialogic narrative analysis comes from Catherine Risman, who took a lot of input from Bakhtin in 1981, who proposed that a dialogical narrative analysis is about interactions, that how people interact with each other, and through these interactions, they co-construct meanings. So what she says about dialogical narrative analysis is that we are not just looking at interactions between the speaker and the listener, like what I just explained to you, but also about the actors in the story, right? So when you are telling other people about a story that happened, for example, between you and your mother, you're telling your friend, or about you and your partner, you are situating yourself as the speaker, and then you're telling the story about you as within the story and your partner as another actor in the story, and the dialogue that happened between you. And then your friend may ask you, okay, and then what did he say? Or what did she say? And then what happened next, you know? So we are talking about what is happening about in those interactions within a text, but also between, between the stories within a text. And these stories can be of different kinds. For example, they can even be the stories that you're not ready to tell now, but you're ready to tell in future. For example, you may have had, if not, that's fine, but you may have had a therapist. And there are stories that you haven't told at all to anyone, but you always knew them. You always knew about, for example, this particular trauma that you had in your childhood. And you go to a therapist and you start telling them about this. So what is then happening is that you are, through that interaction, through those diggings into deeper stories or older stories in your life, you start telling those kind of pre-conscious or stories that are at the pre-conscious level that comes to the conscious level. The other two very important points I want to say quickly about this is the power relations are also very important in stories. And what do power relations mean? Is that particularly, for example, when we are dealing with the stories, we are telling them from a position of power, meaning that you're the teller. You have the power to how to basically to narrate the story. That's why, for example, in disputes, judges listen to both parties because every party wants to persuade the audience, i.e. the judge and the kind of jury and so on, that I'm the right person, I'm the righteous person because of this and this and this. So when we are telling the stories, we're telling them from a position of power. And that's very important in the construction of meanings in a story. And also the constantly changing elements in the construction of stories, because, for example, we may actually forget about different times, about different details of a story. As time passes, we kind of there are a lot of details that are missing, for example, in a story. And the role of audience, of course, I already mentioned this. Now, actually, I have more on the role of audience. So as I mentioned, so those kind of elements about the dialogical approach to narrative analysis based on Rissman and Bakhtin are very important. But going back to constructionist approach, what we say in our chapter is that audience plays an important and vital role in the construction of meaning. For example, if you're talking to a group of people and you see that they're really bored, you realize that what you're telling them is not of much of an interest. And what happens then, you may actually cut down some of your talk, or you may kind of change it in a way. You may actually kind of bring in some jokes in order to kind of vitalize the whole atmosphere. So what we see is that the role of audience is actually quite important in the construction of narratives. And meanings are not just constructed at the time of the telling. So when you're telling a story, imagine for this talk, for example, Raquel mentioned at the beginning that this is going to be recorded, right? So when it is being recorded, it's being made available for a future time. So temporality then is also very important in how I'm telling this story that I'm telling you now. Also, location and social context is also very important in relation to the co-construction of meaning. For example, within what context we're talking about, what is the location? I'm pretty sure that if I was in Coimbra and you were all kind of available in person, that would have been a different kind of lecture. And all of these aspects about the audience and the construction are kind of impacting the construction of stories that are also aspects of the audience constitution of subjectivities. So what does this mean? Each one of you, at the same time that I'm telling kind of this story, this lecture, and anything it can be constituted as a story, you are also kind of thinking about your research. Oh, did I think about this? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's rubbish. So you're kind of positioning yourself as an audience towards what I'm saying. We always do that. We always kind of constantly position ourselves within the kind of stories or discourses that we're exposed to. In which way we are also kind of reconstituting our subjectivities through exposure to these narrations and stories. So what we did say was that tellers are always drawing upon cultural and personal resources when they are constructing their stories. It doesn't matter whether you are part of the audience or part of the teller. Yeah, we are always kind of within this kind of dialogue. We are always reconstituting our positionings. So subject positionings and power are of course at the heart of this process of telling and retelling and meaning making. And of course, there is not, it's not always conflict free. For example, you may talk to someone and they may not agreeing with your storytelling. You may tell a story about your mother and your mother says, oh, no, I didn't do that. And you are like, no, you did, So these conflicts happen all the time between storytellers and listeners. We see, for example, debates, conflicts that happen in parliaments, in disputes between couples, in conferences. So all of these are kind of are quite important. Why are they important? Because people are quite invested in these subject positionings. It's not that they can change quickly their subject positioning by listening to someone. We are quite we have quite a lot of let's say capital that we are putting into what we understand. Let's say, for example, I have done years of research into narrative. until I see myself at the position to actually talk about how to do narrative. So if somebody else comes and says, oh, that what you're saying does not really make sense, I can defend my position because I can defend it from a point of view that I have done a lot of research into this, and they can defend likewise. So what we see is that each side, teller and listener, can produce and consume narratives within a set of power relations, okay? And what we did say in that chapter was that narrative researchers' own positioning within the power relations and the power relations operating between them, the participants, the data, and its interpretation also have to be taken into account in a constructionist analysis. For example, if you think about your dissertations, if you're a student, or if you're a scholar and you have got some data and you're kind of going to analyze it, are you doing it right at the time that the fieldwork is happening, or you're doing it a few months afterwards, maybe a year or 2 years afterwards, maybe 10 years afterwards? Because all of these kind of all of these elements about temporality around the kind of the data that you have collected, how you're interpreting it, they're all very important in what the constructionist analysis would look like. So what we did say in that chapter was that researchers working within this tradition have to analyze their own personal social and cultural positionings, as well as their methodological and theoretical frameworks. So when we do such kind of research, we need to also think about who we are. I mean, who am I as Mastoureh, Fathi, as Massi, kind of looking at this data? I mean, I have done research with migrant men and migrant women. I will show you examples of both. But in relation to these kind of research, the data and how I understood migrant men was very different to how I understood migrant women. Why? Because I was sharing a lot of subject positionings with migrant women in terms of gender, in terms of migrant kind of status, and so on, in terms of mothering practices, maybe later research. But I was not sharing some of these with those migrant men, maybe just the migrant status. But again, that was quite intersectional. So what we see here is that our social positionings are also very important in how we see our data and how we analyze. Okay, before I start on the first example, is there any questions? I can't see you, so if you have any questions, you can just unmute yourself.
I think
no questions so far.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So the first one. This is from a research I did with migrant men in Cork. And in this research, I wanted to know what migrant men who are international students and refugees. So I interviewed two groups of migrant men, let's say, two categories of migrants. And I wanted to know what these two groups understand of home. So what does home mean to migrant men, but also how do they portray it in their domestic space and in the public space? And this is from the interview that was about the domestic space. And I was asking them to take photos and send them to me, and then we would meet to do a photo voice narrative interview, meaning that we were talking about the stories about these photos. So this is Salman. He was from Nigeria, and all of these are pseudonyms. Salman from Nigeria. He was doing his master's in UCC, and he was living with his girlfriend in this flat in Cork. And he was saying that this is my comfort zone. I do everything, trust me. I can be here 24/7 sometimes. So this is right, because I'm a Muslim. Right behind my comfort zone is also my prayer mat. So you see. And I said, oh, I see. And then he said, so I just pray. From pray, I go back there, meaning at the dining table, which turned into his desk. And from there, I go back to pray, because we have to pray 5 times. So this is the couch, and it's always very cold because it's leather. So I spend 95% of the time. I only sleep on the bed. And when I wake up, I come back here. So what Simon was saying here was that this is his corner. This is his man cave. To put it in a kind of in another language, and this was the corner that he had occupied permanently in that flat that he was sharing with his girlfriend. Now, when I was asking him about what home means to him, he actually showed me these two photos. He didn't take any photos of any other part of the flat. He did not take any photos of the kitchen. He did not take any photos of the bedroom. He did not take any photos of, for example, of any other place. In fact, he told me in another part of the interview that that leather couch was basically where they were eating, because the dining table has turned into a desk for him because he was studying. So, and I asked, your girlfriend doesn't complain about this, and he was like, no, she has accepted the fact that that is my space. So what you see here is basically a story. So, well, I don't want to go into the analysis of home because I want to show you that how I analyze it narratively. So this is a story. This is a story about someone. This is a story about a spot. And what was important for me was that not only Salman was kind of picking up kind of a story about his disputes with his girlfriend and about his homemaking, but he was actually showing me a very detailed description of a place within the story of home, within the larger story of home, which could encompass many different things. And he pinpoints the story of home onto two different spots in the place. So these become quite tangible, quite understandable for me as a researcher to understand his point of view about his religion, about the fact that he's a student, about the fact that he studies quite a lot because he says that I'm here 24/7, about the fact that he basically, he's a practicing Muslim, he prays 5 times a day, and because these two are actually quite kind of next to each other, the top photo is on the left-hand side of the bottom photo, so they're next to each other. And that's this kind of corner offers him comfort within that kind of a space of shared space of home or a physical space. Now, so what do we do when we want to do a constructionist approach to narrative analysis of this story? For example, take a story. I took a story about Salman, about his space, then explore how different levels of context, meaning researcher, broader social, cultural, and historical context generate stories. So what I did, so I picked a story about Salman, about this, I found it fascinating about the fact that he was there and so on. But as you notice, when I was explaining to you, I was talking about the fact that he's religious, he's from Nigeria, there are kind of gender imbalance kind of in relation to distribution of power and distribution of space within the space of home with his girlfriend. Both of them were students in Cork. So what we see then, we can generate further stories, not stories that are not true, but stories that can be located and contextualized around Salman's story. Okay, so that's number 2. Then we need to be very clear about how we pick these stories and how we analyze them. So this number 3 is actually about our approach, that how we are kind of seeing this. For example, if you have a feminist lens to understand the space and about home, if you're looking at migrant masculinities kind of lens, or very simply, you're doing a content analysis. So for example, you go back to the story and you look at, let's say, you do a content analysis, meaning how you're kind of seeing that the space and kind of the different details around the space is being repeated, is being kind of talked about. You can do a discourse analysis and so on. So any approach that you choose needs to be clarified later. And then taking multiple constituent elements of narrative as micro units of analysis. So here, for example, in relation to Salman, I took all those little elements in terms of even from the choice of pseudonym. I actually, when I was choosing pseudonyms for these people, for these participants, I was going on a database for names in popular names in all countries. And any national identity that my participants had, when I wanted to choose a name, I didn't, for example, call him Jack. I called him Salmon because Salmon is actually a very popular name in Nigeria, but his name was not Salmon. So taking multiple constituent elements of a narrative as micro units of analysis, meaning that we put together all these different units of analysis together, but within our narrative, within my narrative, Massey's narrative. And then also consider sites for narrative analysis, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. What are the sites we are talking about? So the sites for building analytical paths for doing narrative analysis are these. There are 3 important sites. What do I mean by this? First of all, position yourself. Who are you? I'm Marina, I'm Raquel, I'm Massey, I'm Alice. Yeah, but also, who am I in relation to the data I'm analyzing? Meaning that, am I a feminist? Am I a man? Am I a migrant myself? I'm coming from a, for example, working class or middle class background. Do I share those kind of stories or those political positionings even with my participant? And what are the ethical considerations that I should take, for example, in relation to whether or not we are sharing certain political viewpoints? Somebody who is a right-wing kind of anti-immigrant person, we may have very difficult kind of process of doing this with them because we may come from a different kind of approach to understanding migration. So that's number 1. So to be critical about your own positioning. This is not when you're writing the your methodology chapter and you're writing about positionality. No, this is about every story that you want to analyze, every single quotation that you're going to take from your data, and you're going to kind of build it up in your dissertation and your thesis. Then the second one is the interview context. So I did mention to you that Salman, in another part of his interview, mentioned this and this, right? Why? Because I don't have the time, and you don't have the time and capacity to look at the whole narrative, which was pages and pages of data. But I did mention what I found relevant in my story to tell you about Salman that you cannot see in this particular short story that I showed you. So the interview context is very important because those kind of small details about silences, about pauses, about the voice, about what even they said in other parts of the interview context is also very important. And finally, the historical and cultural context, both within the stories. You see, Salman said that I'm a Muslim. I need to pray 5 times a day. Yeah, there are many other people who are Muslim and they do not pray 5 times a day. They are not practicing Muslims, or they're not practicing 5 times a day. So what we see is that the historical and cultural context, both within the stories and of the time when interviews are taking place, are very important. So these 3 sites you need to always remember. You need to always have them in mind. Who is it that is analyzing them? What is the interview context? Where does it happen? How does it happen? Who is the teller? Who is the audience? And so on. Is there a voice recording? You know, that totally changes how people narrate things if you record them or if you don't record them. And finally, the historical and cultural context. So the final point that I want to talk about is the importance of transcription and translation when we are doing research in migration research, because this is extremely important. Transcription is usually kind of being seen as a mechanical kind of approach to prepare your data. I will talk about this in the next slide. So I want to talk about transcription, translation, researchers' own process of analysis and writing, and ethical considerations. These 4 elements are the 4 elements of constructionist narrative analysis. Now, you may kind of be thinking that then what was this one? This one was when you are picking a story at this level, at level 5. So you pick a story, yeah, and then you need to consider these 3 sites when you're analyzing, when you're reading the data. Now, this is for the whole overall kind of narrative analysis that you need to kind of be mindful of these 4 elements. So the first one, transcription. When we do transcription, we are not just kind of taking, obviously, this research is done before AI. Now with AI, with different technologies, doing transcription is much easier than before, right? But again, you still get a lot of kind of mistakes. So you need to look for kind of check it, listen to interviews, and kind of check the kind of the transcripts that are done through AI tools or through kind of different even teams that we are using now is providing transcription. But actually, the transcription that I mean here is not just that verbatim transcription from changing the form of communication from spoken to written. Sorry, just a second. A lot of storytelling actually happens after you switch off the voice recorder. That's why your supervisors constantly tell you, take notes. You need to take notes immediately after an interview. It's very important. Why? Because we forget what happened. We have a very fleeting mind, and transcripts are quite integral to this process, but also your notes. And sometimes your notes or what you remember from the interview may be contradicting what the interview was, which in itself is quite interesting, because what you have written, the story that you have written, the notes that you have written may be from a position that you have taken after your interview, not during the interview. So that's why those voice recordings and transcriptions are quite important. And then what to leave out and what to include in kind of in your presentation of data is also very important. For example, why did I'm asking myself, why did I bring in Salman's story and not, for example, Adib's story, who was another participant? Or why did I present this part of Salman's story? All of these are questions that you can ask yourself. You can think about them because they will help you to train your mind into not just thinking that, oh, obviously it is very natural that I include this quotation from Salman. No, nothing is natural. Everything that we do as constructionist narrative analysts is through this kind of dialogues that we even have with ourselves. So it's very important to kind of to think critically what we are leaving in, what we are leaving out. And finally, non-verbal elements are very important. For example, laughs, pauses, and also kind of that that you need to kind of to think about why decision making is such an important part to be reflected on in transcription. Then the other part is translation, because when we are working across languages, we are also kind of adding another layer of complexity in relation to meaning making. And translation is very important because we are conducting, let's say, interviews or data collection in one language, and then we need to translate them to another language. And who is the kind of medium in between? Us, researchers or translators or interpreters. And there would be a lot that would be lost in translation. And also, at the same time, I argue in another paper that we have a lot of meanings that are emerging because of that, because we are adding a kind of simple, another layer of decision making, another layer of all the stuff that I told you already to this kind of whole process. So we need to remember that translator is not disinterested. Again, it's not a mechanical kind of process. And of course, I mean, none of these can be avoided. I mean, we can never kind of claim that we are having a neutral or we are not taking a subject positioning. We need to, as long as we address it and as long as we reflect on it, how these stories are evolving across languages, it is fine. We just need to be aware of it. This is my second example from Hassan. Hassan was one of the refugee group kind of participants. He was from Afghanistan, again, pseudonym. And when I asked him to present a photo of his home or what counts as home, he brought this photo to the interview and he said, so this is before kind of we started about this story that I'm telling you about. He was telling me that he actually put a lot of effort into cleaning the house and making it kind of right and so on, and then taking the photo. So a lot of these kind of photos have been staged, meaning that they were not just, some of them were, but many of them were not. kind of about everyday life as it happens, just taking your phone and taking a photo of a status quo. So they were actually staging, they were cleaning and kind of tidying up and so on. And there is a reason for that. There is a reason, maybe more than one, but one of the reasons that it came up quite a lot was that, yeah, I'm quite embarrassed. I don't want you to think that I'm not kind of a clean person and so on, and that I look after my home. So home is very important to me, especially in the context of that research that we was talking about, home in migration. The kind of presentation of home was very important. So Hassan says here, my life is on hold. I have been waiting for 18 months to become Irish so I can bring my wife from Iran. Until then, my life is meaningless. I don't have a life here. It starts when she comes here, when I have a family of my own, when I can rent a 2-bedroom flat, then I can call Cork home. I'm very tempted reading this for quite multiple times. I've read these narratives and so on, and I present them. I'm very tempted to go back to Hassan because now he's got 2 kids, his wife reunited with him, and they have bought a house. And so basically all the stuff that he said here in this interview, which took place in 2019, so before COVID. So a lot of the things that he says that would start for him in future when this happens has already happened. So I would like to know what he thinks now about home. I may actually do that kind of research idea. But what I wanted to say was that when we talk about translation, then here, obviously this was all done in Farsi because I'm Iranian, he's from Afghanistan, we speak the same language. So this interview was done in Farsi and he was saying, my life is on hold. But actually, I thought about that sentence, how to translate this, because he did not actually say my life is on hold. He said, I don't have a life, meaning that because I am in such an in-between kind of position, I cannot progress further. And how would you say that in another language? There is a saying in Farsi that we say that. So that you say gir kardam, which means that I cannot move forward, I cannot move backward. So you are basically in a kind of in a position that you really cannot move when you are kind of stuck in mud. When you are driving a car and you are stuck in mud, you say that you don't say my car is on hold. But what I'm saying is that I actually thought a lot about how to translate this, because you need to convey that meaning to another audience who understand this interview that was conducted in Farsi in English. So that was the point of this slide. The third one is researchers' own process of analysis and writing. So what does this mean? Our positioning as researchers are very important vis-a-vis the participant, because my positioning towards you is not the same positioning towards my participants. Towards my participants, I'm being seen as a university lecturer, as somebody who probably occupies a different social world and so on. My positioning in that sense, from a class perspective, from a, let's say, a social kind of network perspective, is very close to yourself as audiences of this slide, because you have an interest. You're probably a student, university professor, and scholar who has that interest in learning about whatever I have to say. So this kind of the same person is positioned differently in relation to different audience, right? So what I did argue in that chapter was that we have different voices when we are talking to people. We could have authoritative voice, meaning we are separating oneself from our participant. We can have supportive voice, meaning we are putting ourselves in the same position as our participant, or we can have an interactive voice. Yeah. So the interaction between the voices of narrators. And here I have an example about a supportive voice. And this is from my PhD research I did with Iranian women doctors in the UK many years ago. Don't ask me how old I am. But in reading this is actually quite interesting, because at that time there were protests happening in Iran when I was doing these interviews, and there are still, so many years after, there are still protests that are happening in Iran right now. So it is kind of quite contemporary if you read it. And she was saying that I asked her, where do you feel belong to here or to Iran? And this is like after a very long kind of conversation. This was not the only question I asked about belonging. And so you normally don't ask such a kind of binary or kind of simple question about belonging. But this was at the end of a very long conversation. And I was like, so can you tell me where you belong to here or Iran? And she said, I don't know. I don't know. My heart beats for Iran a lot. I mean, I'm so worried about Iran all the time. It's like, I really like it, but I never like to live there. You see? Do you see the contrast? Do you see how it is a complicated situation? Because she's a doctor, she's now settled in the UK. Her heart is there. Her physical body is in the UK. She says, I like my country, but I don't want to live there. And I asked, have you been to Iran since you have come here? And she says, yes, I've been to Iran, especially these last incidents. And I don't know why the rest of the interview is not here, but she basically says, especially these last incidents which has happened, they really make me upset about what's going on in Iran. And then after that, we started actually talking about the protests after this kind of extract. And here, the reason I brought this extract here is because her position was very similar to mine. I was before these interviews that took place in the UK, I went to Iran to do my PhD research in Iran. And then when I was leaving, this is not a story. I mean, this is my story, Mass's story. I was arrested at in the airport for doing my fieldwork in Iran. So when I came back, quite miraculously, I was released and I came back and I told my supervisors that this happened. And they told me that, no, you cannot go back. So I switched to migration. I switched to migrant women so that I don't have to go back. But my heart was always there. My heart was always there and kind of always. So in a way, what Roxana was saying here was almost my words. And then after that, obviously, it was quite natural that we started talking about the protests, even though that they were not planned in the interview and so on. So why I brought this here was because I was positioning myself with the participant. Yeah, I became her friend. I became part of her. I was part of her story, and her story was part of my story, because both of us shared the same positioning. Both of us were migrant women, liking Iran, loving Iran, but not being able to go back, not being able to live there. And these kind of these shared positionings made my voice a supportive voice, meaning that and her voice a supportive voice, because I was positioning myself in relation to her position. So ethical consideration is the last point I want to talk about in this lecture. And that is when we are focusing on people's lives and stories, we are dealing with delicate topics. We're dealing with subjects that are quite close to people's hearts. So essentially, this is a sensitive issue to talk about why people migrate. How do they find themselves in the new country? What memories do they have from the past? And there are ethical considerations that are involved in this, because we are not just making decisions about the data, we are also making decisions about who the participants are. And one of the very peculiarities of research is that when people do trust you, they trust you fully. And they want to actually be part of your research. They want to have a voice. I have, for a long time, I have been thinking quite critically about this whole kind of business of ethical research within institutions, and whether or not in the fieldwork, those considerations are ethical considerations. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I did a research with Syrian women in Turkey. We did an art project, and we kind of we were asking women to kind of to portray an object from home, and then many of these women wanted their faces and their names to be in the photos and on their artworks. We did mention that do not put your name, do not put your real name, and so on. And they were like, why not? I'm an artist. I want to be recognized for this. Why are you telling me not to put my name? So what we see then is that here we are posed with a very, very important question about consent. What are we consenting to? What are our participants consenting to? Whether it is ethical to to give them a false name, and so on. So what we are dealing with is that ethical considerations should be actually included, not as a kind of tick box of your research project or of thesis, but actually thinking critically about ethical considerations, to think about this and to move this forward with our story, with the story that we're telling about ourselves, with the story that we are telling about participants, with the whole story of our project, and how we are dealing with that. So to conclude, constructionist narrative analysis treats the stories as active social practices. This is very important. We are not just dealing with the stories as just words on a paper. Just look at Salman and Hassan's story. These stories, I've read them a few times. I have presented them quite a few times. But still they're active for me, because every time I say something about it and I go back to their interview and I read parts of the interview or the whole interview, I realize that there were stories that I did not pay attention at the time. So it is still actively playing a role in how I understand home and migration and migrant men and so on. Narratives do not just report reality, they organize meaning, identity, and social positioning. Imagine how I presented myself to you. Every time I read these kind of data, I talk to people, I reassess my own positionality, my own positioning, and how I'm kind of understanding these, and how I'm evolving and changing as well throughout this kind of my life courses, but also in relation to the research process. Therefore, analysis must attend to content of your research, sequence of stories, interaction, audience, and cultural discourse together. I have some references. If you wanted to, I'm happy to share these slides with Raquel and Alice, if you wanted them to follow up any of the references, and of course you have the recording. So I think I'll stop here. What's the time? Okay, I don't know how I did with time.